G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to this session. We're now into session 36, the second last to go, and we're going to be covering chapter 51, verse 54 down to 52, verse 17 today. We're still in the section here where we're looking at the prophecies against Babylon. Here we're going to look at Babylon is now going to be recompensed in full. And this is from chapter 51, verse 54 to 58. The point of verses 54 to 58 is that Babylon is going to pay for all her sins and she's going to be recompensed in full. Verse 54 reveals a cry of defeat and destruction. It's the sound of a cry from Babylon and of great destruction from the land of the Chaldeans. So during the attack on Babylon, the land of Chaldea is being destroyed down to every man, and the land is becoming desolate. We have screams of agony and defeat will be heard in the surrounding areas as well. Now, in verses 55 to 56 are the reasons for this great cry of verse 54. And if you look at these three verses here, 55 to 56, we're going to see here that the word, each reason for this destruction is introduced by the term for. The first is the reason for God's destruction of Babylon, verse 55. Here we see, for Jehovah lays Babylon waste and destroys out of her the great voice. So the invasion of Babylon is described as their waves roar like great waters, and the noise of their voice is uttered. So the outcry that will come from Babylon because Jehovah is ravaging the city. He'll put an end to her loud noise. The military invasion is again compared to the sound of roaring waters. Remember, whenever we see it sweeps like a flood or like many waters, things like that, it's a military term about an invasion. The second thing we see here is that the second reason is in the first part of verse 56. And again, we see the word for. For the destroyer is come upon her, even upon Babylon, and her mighty men are taken, their bows are broken in pieces, and destruction is in full. So the word destroyer, notice, is singular. While many nations, armies, and leaders are involved, one nation in particular and one leader leads this assault, and that's the Medo-Persians. And they're going to capture Babylon's warriors and destroy their weapons. Third, there's a third reason for the cry of verse 54, and that is at the end of verse 56. This is the third time he uses the term for. For Jehovah is a God of recompense, he will surely requite. So verse 54 pictures an agonizing cry of the Babylonians. The Babylonians will cry out in defeat because Jehovah is a God of requital who deals retribution. And this is for all her sins. And then in verse 57, he now talks about the fall of the leaders of Babylon. And I'll make drunk her princes and her wise men, her governors and her deputies and her mighty men. And they shall sleep a perpetual sleep and not wake, says the King, whose name is Jehovah of hosts. So God's going to make the leaders drunk. Now, these leaders of Babylon include five groups of people here, five groups of leaders. First of all, we have her princes, and second, her wise men. The wise men of Babylon were world-renowned. In the past, Babylon was known for its magi, who were experts in astrology and astronomy. You can check that out in Daniel, book of Daniel, chapter 2, verse 2 and verse 13. And also in the book of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 2. Remember the magi came looking for the Jewish king. So that's the second group, the princes first, the second were the wise men, third her governors, and fourth her deputies, and fifth her mighty men. So their future is that they shall sleep a perpetual sleep. Perpetual sleep is the sleep of death. They're not going to wake up. It's a death-like sleep, and the declarer of all of this is the King who is the Lord of hosts. Now, this statement that we see here in this is also seen back in Jeremiah 51, verse 39. In verse 58, the prophecy proper ends with a statement of the destruction of the city. We're now wrapping up this prophecy here. Thus says Jehovah of hosts, the broad walls of Babylon shall be utterly overthrown, and her high gates shall be burned with fire, and the peoples shall labor for vanity, and the nations for the fire, and they shall be weary. Weary as in tired, not weary as in watchful, but weary as in tired. So the broad walls of Babylon are utterly thrown down. Now, there's a play on words in this verse, as the Hebrew terms for utterly, where it says utterly overthrown, and the word for overthrown. Utterly, the Hebrew word is arer, A-R-E-R, meaning to strip oneself, and overthrown, arar, meaning to strip oneself also. They sound alike. So it's arer arar is what we see here. Arer arar. What do they call them? Homonyms. Yeah. Now, it says the broad walls are utterly overthrown. These walls were 87 feet broad, 87 feet. That's like a little bit over 3 feet to a meter. So a little bit less than 30 meters wide. Okay. A chariot of four horses abreast could meet another on it without collision. It was so wide. Walls were 200 cubit high, 485 stater. It is 200 cubits high. Cubit is about 18 inches, so it gives you an idea how high it was. And the walls are 60 miles around in total. Her high gates are burned with fire. There's 100 of them. There's 25 brass gates on each of the four sides of the city. The city was a square, and between the gates were 250 towers. That's just a little bit of info there for you. Now it says the people are going to labor in vanity. As for the nations, they're going to be like fodder for the fire. The Babylonians and their allies will not be able to prevent the city's demise. They'll be weary, they'll be worn out. A similar statement to this is made in the little book of Habakkuk, Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 13. Now, in this verse 58, the actual prophecy regarding Babylon, which began back in Jeremiah 51, verse 1, now comes to an end. It's finished. In verses 59 to the first part of 64, we're going to see a symbolic action to emphasize the point made of everything that Jeremiah has said, beginning with the first verse of chapter 51. And with this section now, the actual prophecy regarding Babylon now comes to an end. Now, symbolic act we're going to see in 59 to 64. So, prophecies regarding destruction, which began in 50 verse 1, ended with the previous section in 51 verse 58, 50 verse 1. Okay, now, in verses 59 to 64, the first part of 64, the account of we have a symbolic act is added now to the overall topic of Babylon's downfall or demise. Verse 59 reveals here that a word from Jehovah came through Jeremiah to one specific individual, a man called Seraiah. The word which Jeremiah the prophet commanded Seraiah, the son of Neriah, the son of Messiah, when he went with Zedekiah, the king of Judah, to Babylon in the 4th year of his reign. Now, Seraiah was chief chamberlain. Okay, so what do we know about Seraiah? Well, he was the son of Neriah. This means that he was the brother of Baruch. Remember, Baruch was the scribe of Jeremiah. Baruch was Jeremiah's scribe. You can find that back in Jeremiah 32, verse 12. Seraiah was also the chief chamberlain, meaning that he was like the quartermaster. He was in charge of taking care of the provisions for the trip of King Zedekiah from Jerusalem to Babylon. So he's the providor, if you like. Now, the occasion of this prophecy occurred when Sariah had to go with King Zedekiah to Babylon in the 4th year of his reign. So this means that the prophecy of chapters 50 and 51 came in or before 594, 593 BC, somewhere in that region. This was the year of Judah's plot to rebel against Babylon. And you can see that in a corresponding story, 2 Kings 24, verse 20, 2 Kings 24, 20, 2 Chronicles 36, verse 11 and verse 13, and also earlier in Jeremiah 27, verses 12 to 15, where we told a story about this plot, and also Jeremiah 53, verse 3. Now, no reason is given for Zedekiah's journey to Babylon. The scriptures didn't tell us that here, but the king appears to have been involved in the plot to secede from Babylon. Now, although the rebellion was swatted even before it began, Nebuchadnezzar learned about it. If he's a good king, he'd have eyes everywhere, so he learned about it. And this necessitated an explanation from Zedekiah. It's probable, the scriptures don't tell us that, but it is probable that Zedekiah was summoned to explain his involvement in person. Now, apparently, Zedekiah explained his actions satisfactorily because he was allowed to continue sitting as a king. Later on, though, Zedekiah rebelled against Babylon again, and the outcome wasn't so good. Now, just for your own info here, some Bible scholars and commentators teach that Jeremiah wrote chapters 50 and 51 as an act of verbal vengeance for the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. But that can't be right, because verse 59 refutes that. Jerusalem was destroyed when? 587, 586 BC. Therefore, the prophecy of chapters 50 to 51 precedes the destruction of Jerusalem by 7 or 8 years, because we just said, remember, this happened in going down to Jerusalem, going down to Babylon was in 594, 593 BC. So that was like 7 or 8 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. So Jeremiah didn't write chapter 50 and 51 as an act of verbal vengeance against the destruction of Jerusalem, because it hadn't happened. I'm not sure where they came up with these things. Anyway, moving on. Verse 60 describes a special scroll upon which Jeremiah wrote the revelations regarding Babylon. And Jeremiah wrote in a book all the evil that should come upon Babylon, even all these words that are written concerning Babylon. Now, the Hebrew expression here for a book is Echad Sefer, with Echad meaning one, and it's referring here to a single document, okay? Chapters 50 to 51 were part of the overall book of Jeremiah. However, chapters 50 and 51 were also written upon a separate scroll. This is the Echad Sefer, and that is the scroll that Sariah had to use for the symbolic act he was to perform. If it was the entire book and he threw it into the river, well, we wouldn't have the book. But it was a separate scroll that was written with chapter 50 and 51 on it to be presented in prophecy form in Babylon. Now, in verses 61 to 64, first part of 64, the prophet now spelled out certain instructions to Sariah, the brother of Baruch, Jeremiah's scribe. Now, these instructions that Jeremiah gives him contain 4 parts. First of all, when he comes to Babylon, he is to read all these words aloud. We see that in verse 61. Now, second, it says there, Jeremiah said to Sariah, when you come to Babylon, then see that you read all these words. So he's going to declare them openly. Now, second, he is to make this first declaration in verse 62. The declaration is, O Jehovah, you have spoken concerning this place. And Now, what has God spoken? Well, the main point of what God has spoken in all of these words is what? It's to cut off so that none shall remain in it. This is Babylon. Neither man nor beast, but it will be desolate forever and ever. Okay. Notice here that he says that Babylon will be uninhabited. This is Sarai. This is the prophecy from Jeremiah to Babylon, to Nebuchadnezzar down there in Babylon, brought to them by Sarai. Now, notice here he says that Babylon will be uninhabited by both man and beast forever. Now, as we stated before, since the conquest of Babylon in 539 BC, the area that once housed the capital of the Babylonian Empire has been anything but empty. It was functioning, okay? For millennia, both man and beast have lived there. And Cyrus the Great, remember, Medo-Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great himself benefited from the riches of the fertile land around the Euphrates River. The rebuilt city of Babylon, however, will be uninhabitable. So this means that the jackals, remember the jackals, well, you might remember, but back in chapter 50, verse 39, we spoke about the jackals, and we said back then that there were demons in animal form. So again, we see here, it says that neither man nor beast will inhabit it. So the jackals, which we saw back in 50, verse 39, are not animals, demons. They're demons. Okay. So Babylon, he's saying here, Babylon is going to be a continually burning wasteland for the 1,000 years during which Messiah will reign on earth. Excuse. There's going to be no inhabitants except demons present. And it's also true of what other nation? It's also true of Edom. That's going to be burning as well. Okay, so the reason I'm just mentioning all this is just to say that this prophecy here, it says that this is the prophecy that Sarai brings to Babylon. This is a futuristic prophecy. It's because it says that, no man or no animal is going to live in that place. It'll be desolate forever. We know, just as we just said, that after the Medo-Persians took over Babylon in 539, well, it was continuing on. So this is something in the prophetic future, and so it has to be down into the millennial reign. Now, third thing Sarai had to perform, he had to perform a symbolic act here, described in verse 63. And it shall be, when you have made an end of reading this book, that you shall bind a stone to it and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates. So, as soon as Sarai finished reading the scroll, he used to put on a big grand finale, if you like, and to what he was doing, he used to tie it up, tie a stone to the book, and throw it into the middle of the river Euphrates. Fourth thing he had to do is then to make a second declaration in verse 64, and the second declaration in 64 says this: thus shall Babylon sink. So as the scroll tied to the rock sank to the bottom of the Euphrates, even so Babylon will sink to the bottom. And second, so that's the first thing, Babylon's going to sink. Second, it shall not rise again because of the evil or calamity which God will bring upon her. So once Babylon is destroyed in the future, it will never be rebuilt again. This is futuristic, right? Now, this is not violating the rebuilding of the first Babylon. No prophecy ever said that after the fall of the Babylon of history in Persia, that it would never rise again. This is not what that prophecy is speaking about. However, once the Babylon of prophecy is destroyed in the manner described in these chapters, as well as in Isaiah chapters 13 and 14, we'll see there, Isaiah 13:1 to 14:23, Isaiah 13:1 to 14:23, and also you find it also in Revelation chapter 18. Once it's destroyed, it will never be rebuilt again. It shall not rise again. So this is definitely in the prophetic future. Even today, Babylon is the city is still standing. Now, third thing, it says that they shall be weary. Now, weary again in tired, and this weariness will lead to Babylon's death. It's the same weariness of Jeremiah 51:58, and this weariness, this tiredness, if you like, will lead to everyone's destruction. Okay, here we come to the conclusion of Jeremiah's prophecies. 64, second part of 64. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. Now, the words at the end of verse 64 in the Hebrew text, these are very similar to the words of Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 1. In Hebrew, in the Hebrew text, the book began with the phrase Divrei Yirmiyahu, the words of Jeremiah. That was back in chapter 1, verse 1. It now ends in a very similar way, Adhena Divrei Yirmiyahu. So we have Divrei Yirmiyahu, both in chapter 1, verse 1, and here in chapter 51, verse 64. It's like bookends. This is the end of the book of Jeremiah, from chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 51, verse 64. Now, what these words do is to unify the entire text concerning what Jeremiah wrote. Jeremiah wrote from chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 51, verse 64. Now, in verse 64, second part of verse 64, the text clearly says that the prophecies of Jeremiah end at this point. Now, what this means is that Jeremiah chapter 52, was not part of the original book of Jeremiah. So the words of the second part of 64 exclude Jeremiah 52 from being part of the original words of Jeremiah. It is part of the book of Jeremiah, but it is not part of the original prophecies of Jeremiah. The point of this verse here, 51:64, is that Jeremiah 52 was added by somebody else. Now, the identity of this person is not absolutely certain. The best answer is probably Baruch the scribe, Jeremiah's scribe. He was the one responsible for putting Jeremiah's prophecies into written form from the mouth of the prophet himself. I did see another commentary says that they believe it was Ezra, but Baruch would seem to fit the bill better. Now, as we spoke before, Baruch was the one who was the scribe. This was seen before in this book, that he's the one who put the prophecies into written form. So more than likely, he was the one who added chapter 52. Why did he do this? Well, he did it to show how some of the prophecies of Jeremiah have been fulfilled. He lets us know in this second part of 64 that the prophecies of Jeremiah are ended. And then Baruch lets us know that chapter 52 was not received from the mouth of Jeremiah as such. Rather, Baruch added it to the book to show, if he was the writer, which we believe he was. So Baruch added it to the book to show how the words of Jeremiah were now fulfilled. Of course, and this is very important here, Jeremiah 52 is as equally inspired as the first 51 chapters of the book. It's in the Bible. It is part of the inspired word of God. Okay. In chapter 52, 1 to 34, we see the postscript, which we see here, the fall of Jerusalem. We see it in chapter 52, verse 1 to 34. Now, the basis of Jeremiah 52 is 2 Kings 24, verse 18, down to 25, verse 30. 24:18 to 25:30. In reading these verses, many sections are almost the exact same. So where Baruch got his material from is 2 Kings 24:18 to 25:30. There are two exceptions, though. There are two exceptions. 2 Kings 25, 22 to 26, which was the account of Gedaliah, has been omitted from the chapter, this chapter 52 in Jeremiah. And now Jeremiah 52, which is the book we're going to be looking at now, 28 to 30 is new material. So 2 Kings 25, 22 to 26 was left out. It had to do with Gedaliah, but added into chapter 52 is verses 28 and 30, new stuff. Nearly every verse we're going to see in Jeremiah 52 is a fulfilled prophecy. The divine word is presented as having been fulfilled. And that now lends credence to the notion that all unfulfilled prophecies will also be realized in due time, right? So if all the prophecies that Jeremiah has prophesied so far have been fulfilled, the ones which have not been fulfilled, we can rest assured they are going to be fulfilled in due time. So this section here attests to the truthfulness and integrity of Jeremiah's work as a prophet of God. Now, we're going to cover this section in 6 points. We're going to see the reign of Zedekiah, which we're going to look at in verses 1 to 3. We're going to see the fall of the city in verses 3 to 16. The sacking of the temple, we're going to head these up. I'm just giving you a quick burst here. The sacking of the temple in verses 17 to 23. Execution of the leadership in 24 to 27. Deportation to Babylon, 28 to 30. And the release of King Jehoiakim, verse 31 and 34. So we're gonna look at these headings as we go through. Okay, let's get into chapter 52. We see the reign of Zedekiah. We see the reign of Zedekiah in chapter 52, verse 1 to the first part of verse 3. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. And he did that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. For through the anger of Jehovah did it come to pass in Jerusalem and Judah, until he had cast them out from his presence. Okay, so the summary of the reign of Zedekiah. Remember, Zedekiah is the last king in Jerusalem. We see here in these verses. He was 21 years old when he began to reign. He was a very young man. The duration of his reign was 11 years until the age of 32. His mother's name was Hamutal. She was a daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. Now, remember, the Jeremiah who wrote this book was not from Libnah, different guy. The Jeremiah who wrote this book was from Anathoth. This Jeremiah, the daughter of, the father of Hamutal, was from Libnah. Now, Hamutal is also mentioned in 2 Kings 24:18 as being the mother of Zedekiah. So we're just reconfirming that. Now she's also the mother of Jehoahaz. So Jehoahaz and Zedekiah were full brothers. They were both sons of Josiah, good King Josiah, and Hamutal. The other sons who reigned had different mothers and were therefore half brothers. Now, in 2 Kings 23, verse 36, we also learn that Zedekiah was the half brother of Jehoiakim. Now, verse 2 describes his wickedness. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. So remember, Jehoiakim is his half brother. So Zedekiah followed the pattern of the other sons of Josiah. He learned nothing of God's judgment from them, and he suffered accordingly. First part of verse 3 is a description of the anger of Jehovah, which was against him. For through the anger of Jehovah did it come to pass in Jerusalem and Judah. Now, that which came to pass was because of the anger of Jehovah, right? And on that basis, the judgment did strike. The judgment was until he had cast them out of his presence, that is, out of the land. Now, earlier on in Jeremiah, back in Jeremiah 32, verses 28 to 36, prophetically speaking, the details of this judgment were discussed back then. Remember, we did say when we were going through this that the book of Jeremiah is not in chronological order, okay? Now, the historical repercussions are described in what we're going to be looking at in the following section. Now, in second part of verse 3 to verse 16 is a description of the fall of the city. First part of verse 3 describes the anger of Jehovah. The judgment which now comes out of the anger is given in verse 3, second part of verse 3 to 16. The fall of the city, here we go. And we get a judgment of Zedekiah. Okay. We see the judgment of Zedekiah himself in the second part of verse 3 to 11. Verse 3b presents the judgment of Zedekiah from a human perspective, okay? This is from man's perspective. And Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. From a human's perspective. It is true that Zedekiah's rebellion led to the conquest of his land, Judah, by the Babylonians. But from the divine viewpoint, the judgment came because of Zedekiah's wickedness, okay? In God's providence, both things actually worked together, and he used Babylon as a tool to punish Zedekiah. Babylon was just a tool in the Lord's hands. Verses 4 to 6 describes the siege of Jerusalem. Came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, in the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his army, against Jerusalem, and encamped against it. And they built forts against it round about. So the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. In the 4th month, in the 9th day of the month, the famine was sore in the city, so that there was no bread for the people of the land. Okay. Now, 9th year of Zedekiah's reign would have been round about 589, 588 BC. 10th month in the biblical calendar corresponds to January on the Gregorian calendar. Now, at that time, the siege of Jerusalem started. Verse 4 tells us that. It lasted until the 11th year of Zedekiah's reign, which would have been 588, 587 BC. This means that Jerusalem was besieged for roughly 18 months. Verse 5 gives us that rough estimate. By the 9th day of the 4th month, meaning sometime in July of that year, the famine had become acute in the city, and there was no food for the people. And so, no food, weak, can't fight. They could only watch as the Babylonians breached the walls, for they had no strength left in them to fight. Now, verses 7 to 11 deal with the fall of Zedekiah, with verse 7 describing his attempted escape, his flight. He's trying to get out of the city. Then a breach was made in the city, and all the men of war fled and went forth out of the city by night by way of the gate between the two walls, which was by the king's garden. Now the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, were against the city round about, and they went toward the Arabah. Okay, now, so once the city walls were breached, there was no stopping the Babylonians. All the men of war who were in the city now tried to flee. They tried to escape from the city by night. They left through the gate between the two walls, which were near the king's garden. Back in starting off in Jeremiah 39:4, back in 39:4, from then on, we covered, remember, Jeremiah putting a sack in his back and digging a hole through the wall, all that sort of stuff. Now, we dealt with these various aspects of Jerusalem in that section back in 39:4. So a group of soldiers with Zedekiah escaped from the city, and they are now making their way to the Arabah, which was the plain of the Jordan River, where Jericho was located. So they're heading east. Now, verse 8 shows that the escape didn't work, didn't succeed. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued after the king and overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho, and all his army was scattered from him. Now, the fact that the Babylonians captured Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho shows that he was very close to the Jordan River. He almost escaped. Perhaps the king felt that if he'd got over the other side of the river, he'd be safe, but he didn't get over the other side of the river. he failed. Jeremiah 39 verses 1 to 10 omits the fact that Zedekiah's army was scattered. Yet it is a point that is made in 2 Kings 25 verse 5 and Lamentations chapter 4 verses 19 to 20. Lamentations 4, 19 to 20. Okay. Now, verses 9 to 11 now describe the judgment on Zedekiah. Then they took the king and carried him up onto the king of Babylon to Riblah in the land of Hamath, and he gave judgment upon him. Verse 10, and the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. He slew also all the princes of Judah in Riblah, and he put out the eyes of Zedekiah. And the king of Babylon bound him in fetters and carried him to Babylon and put him in prison till the day of his death. Okay. Now, after capturing Zedekiah, Babylonian soldiers now brought King Zedekiah before King Nebuchadnezzar, who at that time was stationed at Riblah, right, in the land of Hamath, which is up there in Syria. Currently the region that belongs to Syria. Now, Nebuchadnezzar put Zedekiah on trial and he sentenced him in verse 9. Gave judgment upon him. There are 4 parts to Zedekiah's punishment. First of all, he had to watch as his sons and officials were slaughtered in front of his eyes. Second, he was blinded so that the last thing he saw was the grisly execution of his sons in verse 10. And third, he was now bound in bronze fetters like a common prisoner. In fact, this was a mark of disgrace for him, a king. And the fourth thing is, as the other Jews went into Babylon, he was now exiled to Babylon and thrown into prison until the day of his death. Now, it's unknown how old he was when he died. We don't know. And then now we come to the judgment upon the land and the people in verses 12 to 16. Okay. Verses 12 to 4 or verses 12 to 16 are going to concentrate on the land itself. Okay. Now, verse 12 identifies its destroyer. Now, in the 5th month, this is the land of Judah, all right? In the 5th month, in the 10th day of the month, which is the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came Nebuzaradan, captain of the guard, who stood before the king of Babylon into Jerusalem. So Nebuchadnezzar charged Nebuzaradan, the commander-in-chief of the Babylonian forces, with the conquest of Judah. He says, just go down there and deal with it. So Nebuzaradan arrived in Jerusalem on the 10th of Av. You know, Av is the 5th month on the Jewish calendar and corresponds to August on the Gregorian calendar. Now, if you're reading 2 Kings 25 verse 8, these two verses would seem to contradict because 2 Kings 25 verse 8 says, now in the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem. So, what do we have? We have one saying the 10th, one saying the 7th of the month. Now, is it a discrepancy? Well, it's easy to resolve. Nebuzaradan arrived at Jerusalem on the 7th day of Av, while the destruction of the city began on the 10th. As for the year, the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign was 586 BC. That little hiatus there, 586 BC. Now, Rabbinic Judaism, right, the rabbis, all the rabbis who comment on this, state that on the 9th of Av, they set fire to the temple. This is the Babylonians set fire to the temple. Now, the fast of the 9th of Av is still observed by Jews today. Now, in verse 13, the purpose of Nebuzaradan was carried out. It says he burned the house of Jehovah, his temple, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, even every great house burned he with fire. So the destruction of Jerusalem included the burning of a number of things. First of all, the house of Jehovah, meaning the temple. This was the first, right? This was the first of the 4 Jewish temples of Scripture. This was the one that was built by Solomon. And second, it was the king's house. King's house was also built by Solomon, who spent more time working in the palace than he did on the temple. And third, all the houses of Jerusalem, from the smallest to the greatest. Now, not content with burning all the significant buildings in Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar then moved on to the city walls, as verse 14 now shows us. And all the army of the Chaldeans that were with the captain of the guard broke down all the walls of Jerusalem round about. So the city walls, which were Jerusalem's physical security, were now destroyed. And in verse 13, the city itself was destroyed. And in verse 14, the walls were destroyed. And then in verses 15 to 16, we are told concerning the destruction of the people themselves. The captivity is given in verse 15. Then Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive of the poorest of the people and the residue of the people that were left in the city. And those that fell away, that fell to the king of Babylon, and the residue of the multitude. Okay. So Nebuzaradan carried away captive the people into exile in Babylon. And the ones he carried away into captivity included, first of all, some of the poorest people of Jerusalem. Second, the residue of the people that were left in the city. These were those who survived the bloodbath of the destruction of Jerusalem, were carried away captive. And third, those who fell away, or these were the ones who earlier deserted to the Babylonians, they were now also carried away. And then we see the residue of the multitude were carried away captive. Now, the Hebrew term for multitude, which is ammon, is translated in several Bibles as craftsmen. The New King James Version and the New American Standard and a JPS, they translated as craftsmen, and then or artisans. ESV translates as artisans. So basically, what he did here, what Nebuzaradan did here, was he depletes the land of the Jewish population. He took everybody away. However, according to verse 16, he left behind a few people. But Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and husbandmen. But verse 15 just stated that the poorest of the peoples were exiled. Again, verse 16 appears to contradict this statement. Now, solution to this? Well, pretty straightforward. The poorest residents of Jerusalem were carried away. That's in verse 15. Whereas the poorest residents of the land surrounding Jerusalem were left behind. That's verse 16. Hebrew term for husbandmen, which we see here, vine dressers and husbandmen. A Hebrew term for husbandmen, yagav, is a verb that means to till or to be a husbandman. So in the context of verse 15, it's better to translate the terms as farmers or plowmen. So the poorest of the poor who didn't have to go into exile were now to farm the land. And in the verse now confirms what was said earlier, right back down in Jeremiah 39, verses 8 to 10. As far as Jerusalem was concerned, every resident from the richest to the poorest was taken into captivity. But in Judah, which is the surrounding lands, a few people were left behind. Only a very small, poor remnant of the people were left behind. And as we learned earlier in Jeremiah, that small, poor remnant included Jeremiah, he was left behind, Baruch, and the guerrilla forces. However, later, they also left the country and went to Egypt. Now, that is your lot for this session. So we're going to come back and finish off in the new year. I just didn't want to try and cram everything into one section. Oh, let's say, thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong.